You might notice that in this case here, in our demo here, the form class we defined is very similar to the model class. And I did this on purpose. I even used the same property names. There are differences, for example, regarding the arguments here, because with the form class, we specify and configure how the form is being rendered in a template, whereas with the model class, the review model class here, we specify how the data is stored in a database. Nonetheless, of course, there is a connection, because it is the data we fetch through the form which ultimately ends up in the database. Now, there's nothing wrong with the approach we took here. You can absolutely use this approach, and it's a good approach, also doesn't require a lot of code. But if you have a form which in the end just wants to fetch the user input for some model, which is a common use case as it turns out, then you can also let Django create a form based on your model. Basically, like it did it in the admin panel for us, but now not restricted to the admin panel, but to any template we want, as we're doing it here. We're not working with the admin panel in this section after all. Instead, we're talking about some user-facing forms. And you can let Django infer such forms as well. For that, in Forms.py, instead of creating my review form like this, I'll comment this out. Instead of doing this, I'll create my review form a little bit differently. And I will do that by extending forms.modelForm here. Before we had just .form, now it's .modelForm. That still creates a form object, a form class, which we can use like we did before, but we can now connect this to a model, and Django will then automatically take all the model fields and infer proper HTML inputs for those fields and basically give us a pre-configured form based on the fields, on the properties here in our model class. For this, we need to let Django know to which model this form is related, and we do this with a nested meta class. You saw that before when I talked about models. Such a nested meta class is used by Django whenever you have a class which you want to configure as a whole. In this case, to tell Django to which model this form class should be related. And for this, in this nested meta class, you add a model property, and you set this equal to the model to which this form should be related. For this, we import from .models our review model. And it's then this review class which we set as a value here. We don't instantiate it, we just point at it, just like this. And this connects this review form to this review model. Now with that, Django will infer a form, but there is one extra field which we need to add to meta. It's very possible that you have a model where not all the model fields, the model properties, should be rendered in a form. For example, we could have an extra field in the review model where we have the owner comment, and that might be a text field where we as the owner can leave a comment, an internal comment on a review we received. And of course, that should therefore not be exposed to our end users. Now, I'll not add this here, but we could have such a field which should not be populated through the end user and which should therefore not be part of the form which is rendered. And since this is so common, Django wants you to explicitly specify which fields from your model, which properties from your model should be part of the form. You can do this by adding the fields key here and set this to a list of fields that should be included. Like, for example, user_name. And here we use the property names assigned in the class. So username, review text, and also rating. Now, if you know that you want to include all the fields you have and not just a couple of selected fields, then instead of having such a list, you can add a special identifier here, or set a special identifier as a value for fields, and that would be underscore underscore all underscore underscore. This tells Django that all the fields in a model, all the properties in a model, should also receive fields in the form which is rendered. Except for the ID, this automatically added ID field, that will never receive a form field. Alternatively, if you know that you want to render all fields except for one maybe, you could set the exclude field and then list all the fields that should be excluded instead of specifying the fields that should be included. So here we could then render everything except for the owner comment. But here I know that I want to render all fields, so I'll set fields to all like this, and then restart my server. Now with that, if I don't change anything else in my code, if I reload localhost 8000, I get the same form as before, but now it's this review form based on the model form, which actually generates that form. Before we configured everything manually, now we're letting Django infer our form from our model. And as you see, it here infers it correctly. What you'll also notice though, is that our labels are lost. We now got auto-generated labels based on our property names here. But thankfully, we can of course still configure this form even though it's inferred automatically. And that's what we're going to do next.